All right, good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mendy Marsh. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Voice, and I'm really happy to invite you into this conversation about sexual exploitation and abuse. It's not just a few bad apples. So I'm gonna start by just letting you know that we are going to record, we are recording the session. And so that will be sent out after. And if you can stick with us, we will have a quick survey for you to fill out at the end. We're gonna jump into the panel, and then we'll reserve time at the end for a Q&A. So I just wanted to start by just telling you a little bit about Voice. So Voice's overall mission is to reimagine conflict and disaster response in a world where girls and women are respected leaders, activists, and experts designing and implementing solutions to eradicate violence, both in their communities and in the halls of power. We hold a deep and continuous responsibility to examine how agencies are operating in an effort to shift resources to women and girls, especially given their role as frontline crisis responders. And we recognize that women and girls need to be centered in all crisis responses, including in the COVID crisis that we're all faced with today. And that includes in addressing sexual exploitation and abuse. And sadly, we've known about sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid industry for years. We first started really hearing about it way back in 2002 when a report from UNHCR and Save the Children identified that women and children are being exploited by the people that were meant to serve them. So over 67 individual organizations were implicated in that report at that time. You zoom forward to 2008, Save the Children and the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, again, identified really serious underreporting of sexual exploitation and abuse. We have heard stories of UN peacekeepers in 2015 in the Central African Republic. And then you fast forward to 2018 in Haiti, where major allegations were made against international NGOs and UN agencies for sexual exploitation and abuse. And then just recently in 2020, we heard about over 50 women reporting major sexual exploitation and abuse during the Ebola crisis. So but for us on the panel, it's not a surprise, right? All of us here have known for decades that this is a significant issue that really needs to be taken seriously and addressed. And so I'm really excited to dig into this panel with you and the great conversation we're gonna have. So our first panelist is Doris Maholu Sadie. She's a feminist warrior and champion for social justice. She has over 14 years of experience, program management, coordination. She's worked for the UN system in Liberia and throughout West Africa. She most recently served as the Gender Affairs Officer for the UN mission in South Sudan, where she worked on implementing the UN Resolution on Women, Peace, and Security. Our next panelist is Alina Potts. Alina is a research scientist with the Global Women's Institute. She centers refugee women and girls and participatory action research on sexual exploitation and abuse. She's recently been working on a program she'll talk about called Empowered Aid. She has served as the research coordinator on looking at violence against children and women at UNICEF for a number of years. And she's worked on refugees resettlement in the US and Europe. Pamela Schiffman is our next panelist. Pamela is a passionate and experienced advocate for girls and women's rights, social justice, and transformative philanthropy. For over 12 years, her leadership shaped the work of the Novo Foundation. She was first there as a director for Novo's work on women and girls, and then she became the executive director of the foundation. She oversaw foundation's historic giving of over $90 million to support women and girls of color, and she created Novo's Radical Hope Fund. Pamela also, before Novo, worked at UNICEF headquarters. I had the opportunity to walk in her shoes after she left, but she was there for a number of years, and she actually started in 2003 when the Secretary General's Bulletin on the Special Measures for Protection from Exploitation and Abuse came out. And our last panelist, but certainly not least, is Francisca Vigo Walsh. Francisca has been working on refugees resettlements and internally displaced persons for over 20 years. She's worked as a passionate advocate for gender-based violence across the world and focusing a lot on accountability to women and girls. Francisca recently served on the Independent High-Level Commission on Sexual Misconduct, Accountability, and Culture Change at Oxfam. And she led the research in the organization's safeguarding policy and practice. And she's also authored the Commission's report for reforms at Oxfam and beyond. And now Francisca is a key member of the Voice team. So let's dig into our conversation. We've known about this issue of sexual exploitation for a number of years. We know that the responses are inadequate. The policies and practices that are put in place are not doing what they're meant to do. And it remains as what is I like to refer to as an open secret. So I'd love to start with you, Francisca, and for you to tell us a little bit about why this is. What do you think is going wrong? What can we do to change the situation?
Hi, thanks, Mendy. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'd agree that this continues to be the open secret, and for me, I take it to a nuance that the open secret is not even that it continues to happen in the humanitarian sector, rather that accountability, in spite of all of our collective efforts, accountability seems to be still nearly entirely elusive. I wouldn't deny that tremendous efforts have been invested. There's been an ebb and flow of interest in overhauling accountability systems and looking at ways in which we could drive survivor-centered accountability and looking at ways to change organizational policies. But we should also note that interest has been largely, unfortunately, media-driven. For lack of a better term, every time it's sexy at times, driven by a scandal in Congo or a scandal in CAR or a scandal in Haiti. And that's where you see, I've tended to see a lot of interest, funding, and a push, largely donor-driven, towards organizations to kind of institute reforms. And if we go back to kind of to where this initiated, one huge step for humanitarian kind was the SG Bulletin, which my co-panelist Pamela worked on and pushed through. So over the years, that bulletin has evolved into zero tolerance policies, guidelines in organizations, training programs, investigation schemes. But I think there are two things to consider. One, as a sector writ large, we are not great at rolling things out in the field. We're not great at translating policy into practice. And one of the reasons may be that we're not phenomenal at unpacking root causes and moving beyond what is a Band-Aid. I mean, humanitarian aid in itself is a Band-Aid of sorts. And perhaps we have some difficulty in shifting and understanding how to incorporate some of the root causes into our work, which fundamentally with sexual exploitation abuse, it is about an abuse of power. It's about gender inequality. And it's certainly about a vision of other, I think, whether that other is global north, global south, or whether it is other, I, humanitarian aid worker, this person, beneficiary. I mean, if we consider the language, it's been really interesting to see the push to changes in language from, from even beneficiary to now client. We've all played with different words: client, partner, participants, program participants. So I guess with that, I'm saying there is a bit of a shift, but we need to make sure that these aren't just nominal shifts or shifts in nomenclature. Rather, organizational culture change is needed. We see that our demands of accountability and reforms are oftentimes donor driven, which is tied to media coverage, and the demand, the way our sector is handling for the most part is from a risk management perspective. How do we safeguard our program rather than how do we safeguard the survivors or the people that we are working with? How do we safeguard our funding? How do we safeguard our brand? I think I'll stop there for a moment, but that has been my experience with it. It's about risk management. How do we how do we not get into the Guardian's front page tomorrow and get into trouble with DFID or with OFDA, rather than what do we need to shift in the way we have been rolling out our zero tolerance policies? Do we understand what zero tolerance really is, and what's the organizational shift to make that a reality?
Great, thanks, Francisca. That's a really helpful overview. So Pamela, I would love to hand over to you next. I mean, we've known about SEA as it's often seen as a standalone issue, as Francisca said. It's sort of a single incident rather than a systemic issue. Why do you think this continues to be the reality that we're faced with?
Thanks, Mendy, and thanks, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. It's great to be with you all today. You know, you started with talking a bit about that report that came out. I'm just going to read a sentence from that, which this report that came out in 2002 said, it was based largely on children's testimonies collected during a 40-day mission to the region. And this is Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. The team reported evidence of extensive sexual exploitation of refugee children, much of it allegedly perpetrated by workers locally employed by national and international NGOs, as well as by UN agencies, including UNHCR. This was a UNHCR and Save the Children report that came out. Interestingly, this report, when it came out, was actually the investigation was actually not about abuse by those with responsibility to protect. It was actually just a general exploration of violence in the lives of children. And as children talked, what they kept describing was that the very people who were perpetrating violence were those who were supposed to be protecting them. That came out really clearly. So that was in 2002, but that very easily could have come out in 2012 or 2020. I think it sounds very familiar, I think, to many people the panelists, and certainly many people who are listening in today. When that report came out, I think to your point, Francisca, like there was an immediate kind of urgency around addressing the issue. And it was driven, you know, in large part, I think, by reputational protection. And of course, you know, actors who really wanted to see this addressed as well and wanted to see children and women be safe and not exploited. But in that immediate kind of rush to respond, I think one of the things that happened, which was quite amazing, was that the Secretary General's bulletin, that we were able to develop that and get pretty wide agreement among all the UN agencies for a pretty serious code of conduct that would apply not only to UN, but to anyone who was in partnership with the UN. So I think what we can see there, you know, I was brought on board. This report came out in the end of February. I was brought on board about 5 days later to help to develop this code of conduct and to convene the UN agencies. And by the following January, the Secretary General's bulletin had come out. So as we all know, within the UN speed, that's like warp speed. That was really quick. And I think part of what that was, it shows that when we have a political commitment to doing something, we can make changes happen. What happened next, I think, was where we have really lagged in terms of the political commitment to transform our organizations to be able to make them safe and free from sexual exploitation and abuse. Just thinking back to that time, I think as Mendy shared, I was with UNICEF from 2002 through 2008, and I did tons and tons of trainings with NGOs and UN workers about sexual exploitation and abuse by staff. And one of the things that I would always ask in the trainings is, how many of you know someone in all of your time in this work who has sexually exploited or abused somebody? How many of you know somebody, you knew that this was happening in an organization that you worked in? And I never did a training where less than 50% of the people would raise their hand to that question. It was always more than 50% of people would say, yes, I definitely know someone who has abused someone that I've been working with. And then I would ask the question, how many of you have ever done something about it? Like actually taken a step, talked to somebody, and it would go down to like a handful of people who would raise their hand to say, yeah, I went to the rep, or I talked to somebody, or I did something about it. And so I think what it was really clear was that we could really set the rules, and that we were willing to set the rules of engagement. We weren't really to really transform our institutions in ways that would, fundamentally transform power. The final thing I will say about this, which I think is part of why it is ongoing and continues, is that, I came to this work, like many of us who do this, because I was deeply committed to the rights of girls and women, the rights of, all people who are oppressed and marginalized. And so I came to this work as an activist for girls and women's rights and to end violence against girls and women. And what I discovered in this work is that there was a way in which sexual abuse and exploitation got depoliticized and separated out from larger issues of gender-based violence. And therefore, what happened is that we were never dealing with the fact that this fundamentally is about shifting power and shifting culture. It got treated as a technocratic issue that you needed to have a few little HR fixes to deal with. And I think what we see after all of these years is that technocratic HR fixes are not going to work to address systemic sexual abuse and exploitation, which is truly about addressing the power imbalances that allow it to fester. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. Alina, I'd love to hand it over to you, just so if you can share your experience in terms of why this still continues to be an open secret.
Sure, yeah. So, and welcome everyone to the discussion. I worked directly as an aid worker between 2006 and 2017, mostly with IRC in a number of different emergencies, setting up programming for women and girls in response to gender-based violence. And I think, just to illustrate the point, despite all of the wonderful policy and advocacy and changes that did happen in that period, when I got to Cox's Bazar in 2017 and was working to set up services for survivors, it was shockingly similar, conditions on the ground, the types of things that were happening to what was happening in Darfur in 2006. And I think for many of us that are, and many of our colleagues that are working day to day in the real lived experiences of women and girls in these settings, they see that, and they see that disconnect with the policies and principles that come out. We can put a lot into language, but at the end of the day, if we're not delivering aid in a way that recognizes known risk to women and girls and that makes changes to minimize those risks, and if we're not including women and girls in how we're planning those programs and how we're monitoring those risks, then nothing's going to change. We're not sharing that power that we have, and we're not recognizing the ways that we do share it that are harmful. We use a lot of community intermediaries. We rely a lot on different aspects of infrastructure, such as transport drivers, to get people to and from aid distribution safely. We empower a lot of individuals, and we do it blindly, and we don't really even check that power, let alone our own. So that really led me to the work I do now, which is more research, because I think there's a lot of power in participatory research and in ensuring that women and girls are part of asking and answering questions about their own lives and getting that information out there. And, just to also build on Pamela's point, SCA doesn't occur in a vacuum, and so I saw this again and again as an aid worker, and now as a researcher listening to women and girls who live as refugees in Uganda and Lebanon. And they talk about, for example, going to a food distribution, waiting all day, often stepping out of line to wait longer, because when the lines aren't sex segregated, men and boys pressed up against them are grabbing them. They describe this in a lot of graphic detail. So they'll step aside and wait to just let them go, and then come back home very late and then be abused by their husbands because they're accused of either not having gone to the distribution like they were supposed to, or going off with someone and having some kind of liaison and coming home late. And this might even drive some of them at the next distribution if someone comes and says, I'll take you up to the front of the line if you have a conversation with me later, come see me later. That may even drive acceptance of that proposition because it minimizes other types of violence and abuse in the household. And of course, that would not be consent to do that, right? It would just be accepting what is a difficult survival choice that many women and girls make. And so I think, you know, we have to really think about the ways that we interact in aid settings, the ways we set up distributions, which is what I specifically look at, because that's a very concrete representation of power when we're actually thinking about how do we get material resources to people, how do we get food, water, sanitation services, shelter, et cetera, to people. You know, if we're setting these up in ways that, even if inadvertently, open up space for exploitation and abuse, you know, we are accountable to changing that, and we're accountable to listening to women and girls, and they've been telling us the things to do for a while, so we're really accountable to putting those in place.
Great, thanks, Alina. Doris, you and I met in Liberia, right? Way back in 2005, 2006. So we were actively, you know, working on the responses related to the report that Pamela mentioned. You know, you and I trained, I mean, I don't even remember the numbers of staff members, individual, we actually trained peacekeeping troops themselves. So what, I'm sure you have much to say, so I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mendy. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon from Monrovia. So just picking up from what my colleagues have just shared, SEA and what your opening statement, I have been involved since 2005, between 2004, 2005. But before that, I was first a refugee. I was an IDP, and then I came into the aid world. So for me personally, this is something that I witnessed firsthand. I saw as a child in a refugee camp, I saw people who had relationship with, connection with aid worker, the benefit they had as a household than those who didn't have such connection. And then coming to work in the aid world, being aware of what it was and being in the fight against it. As you said, we have had multiple trainings. There have been, a lot has been done into policy, laws, and framework and statements to end SEA. Campaigns have been taken, but today in 2020, we are still here discussing SEA, and people are still alarmed at, new reports or allegations in different settings, like in Congo or so. So for me, it's almost like a failure on our part as an industry, not personally, but because as an industry, we have failed to, do one thing we have worked towards over a decade. And that's why we are having this conversation today. We should be looking at what is it that we are not doing right. Is it about time for us to reevaluate our approaches and interventions to see lessons we can pick up from there and look at the gaps to see how we can move forward? Or do we just continue maybe the old stories and not getting different results? Because for me, from all of my experiences, like working with Child Fund, coming into the UN system, going in a peacekeeping mission, I see that we have policies and systems in place. And internally, the awareness is there. At least people are doing mandatory courses. They are having this awareness of what is expected of them, what not to do. But there's huge gap between the policy and the implementation. So taking it from the book and putting it into action, there's a gap there, and that's where we need to look at. And I see mostly it has also to do with accountability issue. What happens to those who come forward? What sort of deterrence for would-be perpetrator? If someone came forward to report, what action is taken against the perpetrator? We encourage other survivors to come forward. So if they are stigmatized, they are re-traumatized, they suffer from judgmental attitudes from the investigators, who sometimes they are just all male team, or don't even understand the context that they are working on, or if the focal point for is a guy who I know is also an abuser, and you are expecting me to report to him when I'm abused. So there are so many issues that serve as bottlenecks between what we have on the books and to make it to work. And I think those are things we have to look at. If people are coming forward and there's no accountability, they become stigmatized, they become more traumatized. At the end of the day, the next person is not going to report. At the community level, if we as aid workers, as UN staff or whatever, we know what is wrong, what not to be done, but sometimes the information gap exists between the communities we serve and what we know we are not to do. So there's also a challenge there in terms of accountability. Where do community members or beneficiaries report? Are they assured of receiving the needed support? Is it not just the superficial response at the surface level where everyone is reactive to the news and then everything ceases and we all go back to the same story? So the internal mechanism, connecting that to the external one in terms of reporting and accountability, it brings a lot to response in SEA. And if we are not responding, we are not going to prevent, because I mean, the culture of impunity continues and people think they can do that and just get away with it. And another thing I see, a lot has to do with leadership, because heads of institutions, people who are in position of trust, if they are committed to change, they are able to push that change. But if those who are ahead, let's see it as a policy responsibility, maybe I'm just to announce it and interpret it, whether it's implemented or not, there's no action, you will not move forward. So that's why we need maybe people who have the vision for change, people who have that mind to see the change, to be at the table to implement the change. Otherwise, the policies are there, but those who are empowered to bring the change are not going to bring the change. So as change maker, we should be on the table, making sure the change happens. That, like, in terms of response, in terms of leadership, have women who have, I mean, men are our allies, right? But I would challenge, I mean, a woman who is committed to do that, being spearheading it, heading it, would be able to make sure she achieves results and don't just see it as a policy responsibility that she just needs to announce and pass and go beyond that. So those are the changes we need to see in place if we have to move forward. In terms of deployment in emergency, how are we doing our deployment? Are we deploying both like emergency response? Are we excluding women and just all male team? How does that affect the way response services are provided? Am I clear? Yeah.
You're great, Doris.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay. So what would be the difference if you have a balanced team of male and female responding on a humanitarian mission, emergency mission, than when you have all male team or maybe just predominantly men team? So there's a lot we have to really look at the way we engage and see the gaps that's causing us to still sing the same song, I mean, over and over, and we are moving no step further.
Great, thank you, Doris. Thank you so much. You really led us into the kind of the next sort of area I really wanted us to go into. I remember having to say multiple times to people inside of organizations that I was working in that there were perpetrators amongst us, right? And they were shocked. They couldn't believe it, right? They couldn't, they wouldn't dare to think about how they needed to adjust their approaches based on that realization, right? And it takes a toll on us, right? We need to lead the change, as Doris has said, as women, expert knowledge holders who understand this work in a very different way. But it does take a toll on us. It takes a toll on survivors. I think that these organizations who are so concerned about the reputational risk tend to forget that we are re-traumatizing survivors. It creates a heavy burden on them and on us, right? It's frustrating, it's hard work. And so I'd love to bring it over to you, Pamela, to talk a little bit about how it's impacted you and the work that you've done and, you know, relation to survivors and beyond.
Thank you. I think one thing I would just add to what you just said, Mendy, is that there's perpetrators among us and there's survivors among us too, right? And so that there's not this bright line between those we serve who are survivors, but there's actually, you know, as we know, there's many survivors who work in the humanitarian field, of course, and also many perpetrators. So I think just like that, the binary is that we need to kind of challenge that binary in our organizational thinking. You know, I think one thing maybe that I will share specifically in terms of the impact and kind of where I have taken this work is I feel like the place that I have been most inspired by recently about kind of how we can think about this work differently and kind of get some new energy is through some of what has happened around the Me Too movement. And maybe I just would love to share a little bit of maybe more lesser known context about that, which is that, well, first, I think many people know that Tarana Burke really started Me Too, the organization, more than 10 years ago. And that organization was specifically focused on uplifting Black girls who were survivors of sexual violence and specifically thinking about their healing and the supports that they needed to be able to thrive. So that is like the context of Me Too. And then you jump forward more than 10 years later when Harvey Weinstein, who was often called a bad apple, right? That was often called a bad apple, was, you know, accused of sexually assaulting so many women in Hollywood. But the reason that we all know so much about that is in part because women in Hollywood came forward, but what happened to make us know so much about Me Too is that a group of more than 100 farm worker women came together and sent a letter to women in Hollywood. And what they said was, we hear you that you have been sexually abused by Harvey Weinstein, and we want to help you because we know what it's like to experience sexual violence. We know what it's like to experience sexual abuse in the fields. And whether you are abused under the hot lights of Hollywood or under the burning sun in the fields, we know we have to be aligned and we have to work together. And survivors of sexual violence need to come together to come up with the solutions with how we're going to transform our culture and society so that sexual violence does not occur anymore. And that letter is one of the most inspiring letters I've ever read. And I think what it really helped me to see and to really clarify for myself in my work on violence against women and girls is the necessity of bringing survivors to the table to come up with the solutions that are going to end violence once and for all. And I think that's true throughout. You know, I think thinking about you, Alina, and what you described in terms of the research you're doing and the imperative of having systems that are designed by people who are going to benefit from the systems, for whom the systems will work, that they are the only ones who are going to tell us how the systems can best work. So I think my takeaway and what I'm really holding from that in terms of kind of where I get energy and where I see possibility is that it is grassroots feminisms that is going to be transformative and not top-down solutions. And so what those who are working in the international aid sector, the imperative to create conditions so that we both shift power and also are in deep listening and deep conversation with those who are part of the humanitarian aid system.
Great, thank you, Pamela. Alina, let me hand over to you next as Pamela raised up your work again just now, you know, from accountable aid. So over to you.
Sure, yeah. So I wanted to share, and this kind of speaks to the first question too. So when starting to work on empowered aid, you know, I thought, okay, maybe this has been done before, right? Like maybe people have really looked at distribution systems and risk of SCA within different distributions, and it's just more about elevating that work. So looking around, really the only thing I could find was a report from CARE from 2004 in Burundi. And this was in 2018 when I was looking. And I got in touch with the people who wrote it. I tracked them down, you know, talked to them. It was looking at food distributions in Burundi in 2004. They used participatory theater and found out a lot about how there was, you know, women were trading sex for food. and actually said, I said, okay, well, what happened when this came out? Are you still working on it? Are there ways I can support this? And they said, well, actually nothing really happened, because people knew that until it kind of landed in, the donor. I think one of the Scandinavian donors found it and started asking about it. And then, it led to a lot of changes in those systems. But again, it's that kind of what Francisca and Pamela and Doris, we're all talking about, is how this kind of, it's like Groundhog Day, if anyone's seen that movie. We keep waking up and realizing the same thing and committing to doing something about it. And then, time goes by and we do it again. And so with Empowered Aid, we've engaged almost 200 people in Uganda and Lebanon. We've had almost 300 different individual or group discussions with them. We focus on women and girls because they are the ones most affected by SCA as survivors. But we know that, SCA can affect anyone. And I do want to just speak, I saw the question about the, using the language of women and girls. We focus a lot on safety as well, and a lot with our local partners. So one of the things that we did was, when doing this work, we kind of engaged different community groups working in these areas to talk and say, okay, this is what we want to work on. Are other people interested? Do they think this is important? This is what it means to be a researcher. These are the qualities of a researcher: curiosity, interest in giving back to the community. And we really allowed people to decide for themselves whether they wanted to be part of the work with us. We do, women and girls are part of our research team, because we're also focusing on how do we share power, right? Like, I'm a Western-based researcher coming into these aid situations. There's also a power dynamic there. So how can we have constant reflection processes within our own team, because none of us are perfect. And one of the things that was decided with partners was that, we didn't ask many demographic questions of the women and girls that joined our team until we were about halfway through, because we needed to build trust with them. Like, why should they tell us intimate details about their lives before they know who we are? We're just coming in. And so we didn't ask about things like, for living with any kind of disability or anything like that until about halfway through. There were a lot of sensitivities around asking certain questions, and it was felt unsafe to ask certain questions. And so things around sexual orientation, gender identity, even asking unmarried girls if they had children was considered not safe in some of these contexts, because the gender norms are so binary and so threatening for people. And if it's not a safe space for them to talk about it, we need to respect that. So I don't assume, I don't assume, I know how people identify or the details of their lives unless I ask them, and then I can only take them at what they feel safe to share. But I do feel it's very important to empower actors, and particularly actors working with especially vulnerable groups, to have the tools and the skills to do this with the groups that they are safe to work with, because they've probably built a lot more trust than I have. So I just want to say that all of the tools we use, all of our trainings, all of our facilitation guides, our questionnaires, our surveys, everything is online. It's on the Global Women's Institute's website. We can share that link. And anyone can pick that up and adapt it for any group. We can't work with everybody in every subject at the same time, but we do want to make sure our materials are all open source and that people are able to use and adapt them. And then the other thing I wanted to say is just, I wanted to make sure to really share some of the words of the women and girls that we work with. And just to say too that, a lot of focus is on like awareness raising and kind of knowledge, and that's really important, but it's not enough. And so I just want to share this quote. One of the forms of aid that we looked at in Lebanon was cash and voucher assistance. And so an adolescent girl from Syria who lives in Lebanon as a refugee told us, when talking about SEA, she might go to the center, to the organization, to receive the cash assistance. And the employee there might ask her to do something in order to grant her the assistance. Although she is registered and has the right to take the assistance, he asks for something in return. He might ask her to go out with him, for example. She is obliged to. So just knowing, like, people can be very educated about what they have the right to receive, that no one should ask them for anything in return. If it comes down to whether you're going to get the cash or not, as Doris said, when she was in Chad, like you could see how people who had relationships were benefiting, and they were making these decisions based on survival. Until we get really serious from the level of senior management, safeguarding leads to really take responsibility for our organization's role in creating contexts that are conducive to abuse, and really addressing not only the people, but the settings that allow for this. Because if we wait to hear about the bad apples, so much has happened by the time we get even one report. Really, how do we address those settings? How do we include M&E staff in transparently monitoring and reporting on safety and risk in everything we're doing? We're leaving women and girls vulnerable to these situations, and they're making these decisions in a context where, because of the pandemic, we already saw aid budgets shrinking. We now see a lot of resources being moved to pandemic response and even further away from not only gender-based violence response and protection in general, but even food. The food basket has been minimized in Uganda. People have less access to aid. They have less access to transport for work. They have less ability to work. They're in more dire need of things they need to survive. So the risk is actually getting bigger, and the time for action is even, let's say, even more important than it has been in the past. How
Thank you, Alina. Doris, I want to hand it over to you just to talk a little bit about, how working on this issue has impacted you, or the survivors and the realities of the people that are left after aid is distributed, for example, or the children. So over to you, and then Francisca.
Okay, I think sexual exploitation and abuse, like other forms of gender-based violence, leaves survivors with many consequences, ranging from psychological health, social, and even a larger societal consequences. From experience here, we have seen, due to the huge presence of aid workers we hire, the peacekeeping mission in Liberia, you will now find communities with even children that were, people had with peacekeepers, right? Who have returned to their countries, but you still have those children. They are now with our fathers. Some may have been abandoned also by the mother due to many other, issues. There's issue of stigma to the parents, the family, to the child, where's your father? And even if the child looks different, it makes even matter worse. And what we have seen here is, like, as the mission leaves, when the mission is around, their response services is mostly superficial, is limited to the same kind of services you have for survival of other form of GBV, emergency assistance, like maybe health, some short counseling, and that is done. But these long-term consequences or impact on survivors, there's nothing done about it. And at the end of the day, the impact is left in a community as a scar. So instead of the impact of humanitarian work or peacekeeping work in this country, we have a scar, a physical scar you can see of the kind of damage that was done instead of help. So the community, those children become wayward children because lack of support, their development, access to basic services or so. So the impact, it goes beyond the generation that was directly affected to the next generation, which is something that needs to be looked at. What happened to survival beyond the emergency assistance, especially those long-term consequences, how are they addressed at the end of peacekeeping mission, and even within the development setting, because we know that SEA is not just happening in humanitarian setting. When the emergency is over, we still have development work. You still have people with power, and you still have community with vulnerability. So the relationship, these exploitative relationships are still happening. It is more complicated when you have national institutions even doing something that is worse than what you see in a humanitarian or development setting. So sometimes it makes the development setting or humanitarian workers to feel complacent, because at least for us, we have some principles or we have some mechanism in place, but here is the national institution, this is what they are doing, or the local context, this is accepted or so. So the consequence on survivors is huge, and if you have been involved, like some of us, at the end of the day, you still live and see it as a way of maybe failing to meet the needs of those you have tried to help over the years, and it's still a huge gap. So as we talk about response mechanism, I think it will be a good way also to think beyond what is done in terms of the emergency response or the immediate response, but the long-term response to survivors. And these are things that are not being addressed in the existing framework. What happens to that child until they becomes 18? What's the impact on communities or society? How are we going to hold those responsible when they return to their country? Is it like seizing their benefits or whatever to contribute to the children they left behind? How do these survivors, gain access to those people, to the perpetrators or so? Or what channel exists for them to seek support? There's no answer. So it's something that still needs to be looked at and still needs to be brainstormed and still needs to be addressed.
Great, thanks, Doris. Francisca, I wanted to hand over to you if there's anything you want to add around the impact on this work for you, or a more feminist approach to accountability to addressing sexual exploitation and abuse.
Thanks, Mendy. Yes, and just piggybacking off of something that Doris just shared, I think it's really interesting that we don't really have the response unpacked yet, and we don't have that down pat despite the years of efforts and serious goodwill from well-intentioned and meaning advocates and practitioners with the backing of senior management as well. At times, oftentimes when I go into the field, I find that fundamentally people don't know where to turn for help. People don't know where to turn just for the even most simplest of things, such as reporting. And so we're clearly lacking still in understanding our own accountability systems, or how to decentralize them and kind of root them in the field. And I think this ties to Doris talking about, how do you provide the support in a way that makes sense? Well, that's about survivor-centered accountability, right? It's about what do they tell us they need, and that is a shift away from that global north-south divide that marks our humanitarian system and marks our structure amongst staff between international and national and local partner and so forth. And thinking about survivor-centered accountability, that is effectively a feminist approach. So if we're going to enlarge or think about, well, how do we shift organizational structures, or how do we think about accountability and move from a risk management perspective to fundamental change, I would beg us all to think about, how do we shift the whole humanitarian sector towards a feminist approach and a feminist transformative agenda, which fundamentally is about supporting change. It's about recognizing power and privilege. It's about celebrating diversity amongst us and challenging discrimination amongst us. It's about do no harm that is truly integrated into our work. It's about more horizontal levels of power rather than vertical. We're still so incredibly top down at every level, whether it's headquarters in Geneva and within, headquarters in New York and within, and then how that trickles down or how that unpacks to the field. It's a really long journey. And it's about committing to organizational transformation. And it's about me too. It's about nothing about me without me. So I don't know the how, but moving towards a feminist approach, which you don't need to be a woman, obviously, moving towards feminism transformative change in humanitarian assistance, I think would go a long way in helping us unpack and understand how to tackle sexual exploitation and abuse in our sector.
Great, thank you, Francisca. I love this, the focus on horizontal levels of management and thinking about, we've got to disrupt the entire system to generate the change that needs to happen. And I think part of doing that is also, sadly, talking about what I kind of consider to still be the elephant in the room. The people that are perpetrating sexual exploitation and abuse against women and children are largely men, right? How are we holding men to account? We still have significant numbers of organizations providing humanitarian aid who are run by men, right? Who are perpetrators themselves at the top and then throughout various levels, right? How are we holding them to account? How are we trying to shift those circumstances, those organizations? Because I think it's fair to say that any organization who is not reflecting on how, if they have men in positions of power when they are supposed to be providing aid to women and children, they are potentially negligent, right? And so how can we think about that feminist structure and that feminist approach to disrupt the humanitarian sector as we think about how we hold men to account for what is still continuing to happen? So I don't know who would like to jump in first, but Alina, maybe I'll pass over to you first.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the quotes that stands out most to me from the work that we've done in Uganda and Lebanon, we spoke with men, women, girls, and boys in refugee and host communities. We spoke with 8 actors. And this is actually from a group discussion with host community boys in Uganda. So, and it's always stunning to me how clearly they understand and recognize the power dynamics and gender dynamics at play from a young age. So they're talking about, again, a survivor of SCA. She cannot tell anyone because she's using that as an opportunity for adding her food ration. So she will not tell anyone about her situation. Because if she tells anyone about her situation, this person will follow the person who is doing that to her, and the person may lose their job, which will also make her lose her addition to food ration. So they're saying very clearly, like, why survivors don't report, right? At the same time, men in Lebanon told us about how they tried to address issues of SCA. These were Syrian men, and they tried to go to an NGO, address an issue with a male perpetrator, and were just not believed and were told that what was happening wasn't right and thrown out. And this made them feel extremely disrespected, upset, etc. And another host community discussion with boys in Uganda, they said, "We the boys, these do not affect us," meaning SCA, "as it mostly affects our sisters, the girls, and our mothers, the women, and our aunts." So, they're recognizing, again, this is a very gendered issue. And I think when we think about male perpetrators, we can see that even in the recommendations that the women and girls we worked with put forward. One of their top recommendations, and this is coming both from those living in very urban, peri-urban settings in Lebanon and very rural settings in Uganda, so very different settings, there was a lot of overlap. And one of the top things they said was more women aid workers. We want the face of aid to be female. We want not just staff, but volunteers, organizations, community organizations, women's organizations, feminist organizations. We want them to be in positions of power and leadership, and also to be the interface that we have with the aid community. And I think there's a lot of lack of safety there. In Lebanon, there was a lot of discussion about the unsafety that was felt when men come into the home to make repairs in the home, especially for sanitation, et cetera, or come to do housing visits. And one of the things that we've talked about with aid partners there is having teams of men and women working together to do this. So there's a lot of, I think, recognized fear among women and girls, and we need to respond to that fear. And we need to understand that's coming from somewhere. It's coming from exchanges they've had. It's coming from abuse they've suffered. And even boys living in the host community in Uganda understand why they're not reporting that. They're not saying that. at the volume that they could be, because it's not safe for them to say that. And many of the people they would have to say that to are also men and also aid workers. And I think when we think from the community's perspective, why should they trust someone, you know, in a big white car with a lot of logos that, you know, why would they think they're not connected to the people like offering the abuse, right? So why would we ask them to trust some of us and not others? I think the issue of trust, you know, we really have to understand that lies on us, right? That's earned. That has to come from somewhere. And when people see again and again that the perpetrators just move from organization to organization, that there's no real accountability, then the trust isn't there. So we have to get real about who's perpetrating and about why it feels unsafe to be alone in a room with a man, or to be, you know, to be receiving aid from a man, and to really understand that until we shift power dynamics and who's delivering aid and really listen to those fears, people will continue to rely on their survival mechanisms. And part of that is surviving the aid process itself. Great.
Thank you, Alina. I love this. I just want everyone to hear this again, that young children, and through the research that you're doing, are calling for what we want the face of aid to be more female, right? We want the face of aid to be women leading the response at all levels. There's nothing about us without us, as Francisca noted. So Pamela, let me pass it over to you next. I can tell you've been gearing up.
No, I mean, honestly, I'm just like agreeing so much with what everyone is saying. I'm like, you know, want to like clap every time, you know, Doris and Alina and Francisca talks. You know, I think ultimately people closest to the pain have to be closest to the power. Like that is fundamentally what needs to shift. And so I really think sexual abuse and exploitation is actually just like one inroad into an opportunity to shift the entire humanitarian sector to work better for everyone. And actually to work better in all ways. You know, this is when we eliminate sexual abuse and exploitation in the humanitarian system, the humanitarian system is going to work better across the board, I think. And so I feel like we have this incredible opportunity, but it requires us to be explicit about the questions we're asking. And it requires us to think about giving up power and shifting power in really fundamental ways and doing things differently than we've ever done them before. So the questions I think that we need to ask all the time is this contributing to disrupting power, or is it reinforcing power? Is this going to reinforce patriarchy or disrupt patriarchy? So many times I think what happens in these systems is there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction to, for example, we need to have everyone, and we need to have equal numbers of men and women involved at all levels, which is a really, one understands where that comes from, right? But maybe what the questions are we need to think about is, how are we going to disrupt patriarchy, and what does that require? And having a more nuanced and complicated conversation about gender and power. So I think we have an incredible opportunity here, even though, you know, as I said, I've been, you know, was involved with this so many years ago, and I see, and there's so many of the same things that are happening, so many of the same conversations that are happening, and, you know, hearing the description of the children in Uganda and Lebanon who are saying what many children said 20 years ago, that I think there does feel like an openness and a crack to be able to really do some fundamental transformation. So I feel very hopeful about that.
Great, thank you, Pamela. Yeah, definitely. I think there are cracks in the patriarchy, and we have to fundamentally disrupt it, right? And I love this comment that you just made, that the people closest to the pain need to be the ones in power, right? And I think that this is an opportunity, right? We are having sometimes the same conversation, but in many ways we are talking about it in a different way, right? We've got to disrupt the systems that have existed up to now and be honest about that and what is going to be required to really do that. So Doris, let me hand over to you next.
Okay, working with me. Quickly, I would just like to say we have to be careful. As much as we need men to be able to achieve our goals, we have to be careful not to be reinforcing like the gender norms, as other panelists indicated. And sometimes maybe the decision we make in terms of selecting men and the way we engage with men being champions at community level could even be hindrance to women accessing services or being able to come forward to report. If someone who is known perpetrator is today being championed as the male champion for gender equality at the community level, so women who may have had issues coming forward already see that maybe I'm wrong, because they see this person a different way, and the humanitarian group see them in a different lens. I have seen organizations organize all male conferences, like male champion groups, and they are on the table discussing issues about women, without women and for women. So we have to be careful of that, because sometimes the decisions which may not necessarily be in the interest of the women and girls we tend to protect. So as much as we need men on our side to break these barriers, to end SEA and other forms of gender-based violence, we have to be very strategic in the way we engage men, so that they are working maybe side by side, but they are not necessarily our voices, because women and girls have that voice, and they know what they want, they know the change they want, and they are capable of bringing about that change. So we should not further disempower women in our attempt to bring men on board to assist in ending violence against women and girls.
Great, thank you, Doris. Francisca, I'm going to hand over to you next, because we're going to wrap up the panel now. We have some really amazing questions coming in, so I'll let you have the opportunity to say the last few things, because for our panel of women, and which is so, I hate to say it, as Doris said, we have to get rid of the manels. We have to make sure that we are centering the realities on women and girls, and bringing women and girls into those conversations to lead those conversations, right? So over to you, Francisca, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
No super enlightening final words of wisdom, other than to note that I think the past 2 or 3 years has been a year of reckoning, well beyond or thanks to the Me Too movement. We've seen unprecedented amount of navel gazing and internal reports and airing, frankly, of dirty laundry. We've seen that with the work that Oxfam did, with the high-level independent commission that they commissioned, for want of a better term. We saw that with the UN AIDS report, the UNICEF report, and it's quite significant. I think one huge step is that it's been quite significant how transparent they've been. Or we think that they've been. We don't know what else has been uncovered that has been shared in these reports, but how transparent they've been in issues of power and patriarchy that staff have put forth to these investigative bodies that have been commissioned by UNICEF, by UNAIDS, by Oxfam, and it's quite interesting and refreshing to see, or helpful to see, that all conversations around sexual exploitation and abuse are challenging organizational senior management to look at power and privilege and general issues of bullying and abuse within the organization, because these things don't exist in a silo. And where I am concerned is I don't know how we are shifting beyond the 80-page reports of recommendations. And what do you do, to somebody's question in the Q&A section, how do you convince senior management when you've already laid it out black and white and you've put forth a possible roadmap for their consideration on how to transform an organization? Besides feminizing a board, for example, how do you actually move forward so that we're not here in 5 years with another massive scandal? And that's the tricky bit.
Great, thanks, Francisca. There's a number of great questions coming in, but maybe we'll pick up on that one just that you mentioned, Francisca, about how we have laid it all out, right? We have noted the cultural and systemic change that needs to happen. But what can we do differently this time so we aren't here in another 5 years, another 10 years having the same conversation? Who would like to jump in to respond to this from the panel? And maybe I'll just also reference another question, because one is, how do we think that the impact of COVID-19 will be on sexual exploitation and abuse in the international humanitarian system? Because I think that is a good question to reflect on, because I would start by saying that I don't think that we are recognizing that the COVID-19 has had and will continue to have dire consequences for the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse. And if organizations and senior management are not willing to recognize that right now, when we are faced with what is the biggest emergency reality that we've all ever faced, and actually the issue of violence against women and girls is even a bigger issue, right, than actually COVID is, because it's, right, how are we going to get these organizations to listen and to change because we have made these recommendations before? So who would like to jump in?
I'll jump in.
Thanks, Alina.
I've had the longest break since last time. Give other panelists a chance to breathe. Yeah, I mean, I would just like to say, I think, to some of the questions about, like, okay, these are the drivers, what do we do? How do we do it? I mean, that's the same kind of burning question I've had, right? Like, let's just do this. And so the phase of empowered aid we're in now is super practical. It's we partner with aid organizations. So in Uganda, we work with IRC and World Vision. In Lebanon, we work with CARE and a Lebanese organization called Orda. And I should say, in both countries, the work in empowered aid is led by women from those countries. And so we are literally, we organize distributions and we put in place the recommendations and we measure how they work. And so, for example, we're working with World Vision and IRC in Uganda to have food distributions and have a site where majority of the staff are female. And we look at the monitoring tools that agencies are already using for distribution monitoring and put in questions based on the risk and safety measures that were shared with us in the first phase by the Women and Girl Research Team to measure perceptions of safety and risk. And to look at, do we see in this distribution where there's majority of women staff differences compared to the other distribution sites? So it's something, if we want to use fancy language, we can say it's implementation science, but literally it's just good programming. And, for me, it brings up a lot of conversations I've had in the past with, for example, heads of agencies or, people organizing mass distributions, where we brought up these things and they say, well, we don't have the money for that. We don't have the time for that. And I always say, well, maybe it's going to be less expensive. Maybe it'll be quicker, right? We don't know. So, so this is really an effort to show rather than tell. So to literally put in place what women and girls are telling us, to do it, and then to measure how it's working. And so we're doing that. We've been doing that with food and dignity kit distributions in Uganda and with food and fuel voucher distributions in Lebanon. And the thing is that this all unrolled at the same time as COVID-19. So we had to kind of stop and think, well, how do we distribute safely in the context of COVID-19? We aren't pushing our research forward. We prioritize the safety of the people that we work with, but it became really imperative. We had already procured dignity kits. People really needed these resources. So we gave up a lot of our kind of research questionnaires and whatever to say, okay, the priority here is getting these things to people safely and still understanding how we do that in the context of COVID-19, even if we can't do the extensive kind of focus groups and things we wanted to do. So we've actually developed tools for this, but I will say, coincidentally, a lot of the recommendations that Women and Girls made about, they wanted smaller groups of people coming to a site, not massive groups. They wanted consideration for when aid can be delivered more at household level, in addition to, consideration for how do you get safely to and from a site. And as I said, more female aid workers. A lot of these things corresponded with COVID-19 safety measures, right? Like you can't have mass distributions with everybody gathered at the same time under COVID-19. So we've been doing that, and we're putting together a toolkit that will, be sharing as well, so that others can learn from that. And it is really practical, and it's meant to recognize that it's hard to get food out to hundreds of thousands of people, right? We know this, but it's not impossible to do it in a way that's safer than it currently is. And I do want to say that BPRM funds this work, and I know is really driven for those practical tools and resources, and we want to contribute to those as much as we can. And just also say that I think, in terms of COVID-19 and just in general, we really want to make sure that you don't have to report SCA in order to access services, right? So in order to access services such as case management, psychosocial support, et cetera, you don't have to make a formal report, because this can be a big barrier to accessing services. Under COVID-19, many services have had to close down, are harder to access as well. And a lot of what we've seen so far in the findings from the distributions we've done is that a lot of the fears that women and girls have around SCA and gender-based violence, there's also fears around some of the ways that COVID-19 safety measures are being enforced. And so those things are all kind of melding together into a situation that's very difficult. And particularly in Lebanon, men are choosing to stay home because they can really suffer at checkpoints. And there's this also corresponds with an economic crisis in Lebanon, a lot else. So women are actually going outside the house more and kind of seen as maybe more able to negotiate their way around all of these things and being even more at risk. So there's a number of ways that it intersects, but I think we have to also kind of keep alive the support for services for survivors. How do we reach them, and how do we ensure that if they're seeking services for SCA, they're not told like you have to report this in order to receive services, but that the services are prioritized. And if they feel safe to make a report, they can. If they don't, maybe there's contextual information without having to, in any way disclose any information about the survivor that can still be used to inform that response and make it safer.
Great, thanks, Alina. Another interesting question that's come up through a few different questions is, what should we only be deploying women? Right? What's the transformative sort of structural change? What do we do about male silence around this issue? Right? Why is it most commonly still women who are bringing this issue to the table? How can we really get organizations to reflect on the fundamental changes that are needed just in terms of how aid is distributed and how it is organized, right? So anyone on the panel that wants to bring in some other solution ideas or thoughts on this question of should we just start making the face of aid women, right? And get rid of this idea that we can get away with having men in these positions. Who would like to jump in? Francisca, you're off mute. I don't know if that means you want to come in.
Oh, I am? Dang. I didn't realize. No, I don't. I don't expect that necessarily all of the co-panelists agree with me. So let's have this discussion. I think that we need to feminize aid. I don't think that the solution is putting men on the sidelines either. There are key moments in my aid career that stick out to me, and are specifically regarding sexual exploitation and abuse. And I could share some pretty horrific comments, and they were all delivered to me by men, such as the head of a very important UN agency in Iraq, telling me, you understand the gravity of what you are telling me. You understand the repercussions and the damage that you could possibly do when I brought an accusation to this person and shared that I would be sharing this. Or someone else, you know, a peacekeeping mission on the Dominican Haitian border telling me, oh no, that's terrible. They are under, those peacekeepers are under strict instruction. They understand, you know, no Haitian girls, only Dominican girls. So these are things that are happening because I think, not because they are necessarily men, but because of still the root issue of gender inequality, gender disparities, and lack of understanding of power and even one's own power. I don't think that putting men on the sidelines is the answer. I think that integrating women and integrating feminization into how you do, into the very male-dominated shelter and wash world, or even how you just do the needs assessment and getting it done within a day and submitting a proposal, that's where I think the key changes are, accompanied by very, very clear and strong commitment and articulated by leadership of how things need to work and what aid looks like. That's one thought that I could share.
Great, thanks, Francisca. Pamela, how about passing over to you next?
I just wanted to add one quick thing, because I really think the thing that we all know kind of intuitively, and we've all seen from our experience, is that leadership matters so much, and that this looks so different from place to place, and it's so dependent on leadership. And so I think that one really important thing that we need to be doing is to think about how we institute better systems for evaluating staff performance, which look at things like how you're addressing patriarchy and racism within your organization. Like, what are you actually doing to promote a more equitable environment? Like, that those are actually taken into account in your performance review, right? So like really thinking about how we evaluate effectiveness based on equality, that those things are like important. And part of that is like 360 reviews and really trying to, again, challenge the very hierarchical way that most organizations operate, and create organizations that are more transparent, that are less hierarchical, and that create more space for different voices to be heard and respected and acted upon.
Great, thanks, Pamela. Doris or Alina, do you want to come in on this part of the discussion? No pressure. We have a lot of other, yeah, Doris, go ahead.
Well, I think it's covered. I think I agree with Francisca and Pamela. We cannot absolutely do this on our own. We do not intend to silence the men, but we need a more feminist approach, and that way we can be able to achieve our goals. So the solution is not having all female team being deployed, or just only, we don't want to go that way. We need all of the hands we can get, but we need to be the one to be in control, to champion that cause. Great,
thanks, Doris. Another interesting one in here, question is, do we need to think about doing something to sort of, there's a lot, we know there are a lot of perpetrators who are just continually, they're known, right? Then they're continually passed from one organization to the next, or from one mission to the next because of that. Many individuals may stand to lose a lot if they are revealed, for example. Do we need to be thinking about, like, what do people think about the ethics of doing something different to actually almost crowdsource, to create an accountability mechanism on known perpetrators? So I'm just curious if panelists have thoughts on this particular question. I mean, it could be something similar to the grassroots kind of movement related to Me Too.
I mean, I will say, I think, and I've talked about this with you know, with a few different kinds of actors in safeguarding lead positions, et cetera. But I think, you know, there is a lot of grassroots knowledge, right? And I would say it's not only about who's perpetrating, but again, a lot of what we work on is considered contextual safeguarding, right? So not just dangerous people, but dangerous places and situations. And so many of the places I've worked, and I think many of you listening know this as well or better than I do, you know, people know the houses where cars are parked outside of at night, or they know, you know, the settings that are dangerous to kind of transit through, for especially for women and girls, or they know, you know, they know like different staff that are dangerous that move around from organization to organization. A lot of, I think we have to remember again, safety, safety, safety. So a lot of times there isn't a lot of cover. You know, if somebody reports or somebody says something, whether it's an individual, whether it's a local organization, grassroots organization, there's fear of retribution, right? These people hold a lot of power. And so we have to kind of think about those power dynamics, and we think about how do we kind of set up safer systems for recognizing and maybe having, you know, taking that whisper network and trying to make it more formal. And so I think one way to do this is for organizations that hold power and responsibility around making aid safer, which would be every aid organization, to really think about, you know, how do you engage with local actors in ways that are safe? Is there a way of supporting like anonymous feedback and discussion that can then be investigated? And you know, what does that mean? How do we do that? Because the current systems aren't safe enough. People aren't using them and don't feel safe using them a lot of times because they're just not safe enough, right? How many times have I entered an aid agency office or UN office and there's a feedback and complaints box right next to the desk where the officer is sitting? Nobody's going to put anything in that box that is controversial, right? So how do we engage? How do we have those conversations? How do we find that out? So I'm just saying, like the dynamics around this are so complex and so specific. And I guess my final message would be, women and girls living in these situations as refugees, as people who are dependent on aid, and the grassroots organizations that represent them, they are the experts in this. You know, we need to be going to them, finding out how do we learn from you and how do we do better. And so we can all help do that. And I'll just wrap up there.
Great. Thanks, Alina. Francisca, I think there was one thing you wanted to come in to mention, and then we'll wrap up with one last question.
Yeah, to disclosure and some of the ways that we could work on preventing the circulation of those not just few bad apples amongst us. You know, there have been several initiatives, and one important initiative that the Steering Committee on Humanitarian Response, came up with is the Interagency Misconduct Disclosure Scheme. And it's pretty surprising. I mean, several organizations have signed up for this or in the process of aligning their internal reporting mechanisms such that they will then bilaterally share with the steering committee any confirmed accusations and disclosures to avoid aid workers continuing to circulate in the system. But there are a lot of big, important organizations in our space that have not yet, which I think sends a bad signal. And that's one key action that they could take.
Great, thanks, Francisca. I just wanted one last question, if anyone from the panel wants to come in on this, and then we'll wrap up. Are there any additional good practices that you've observed or are aware of in terms of transforming organizational culture, especially in organizations where there is this resistance to change, maybe ones that are more male dominated? Any final words?
I haven't seen it yet. I've
Okay.
seen roadmaps. I've participated in roadmaps, but I haven't seen us get there yet. And I think one of the missing links is that we have all these accountability mechanisms for measuring the efficacy of aid, measuring whether or not women and girls are getting what they need, but we don't yet have one for looking like a gender audit or a feminization audit of senior management.
The one
Great.
thing I would add is like there's the leveraging of both like grassroots feminists who are challenging organizations to change, but also the role of donors, right? And saying like, actually, we don't want to fund organizations which we know are patriarchal and where we know harm is being done. And so I think it's both utilizing the leverage and the power we have at both ends.
I'll put a tool in the chat. It's from Raising Voices, which is a wonderful Ugandan organization that does a lot of violence prevention work, and it's called Get Moving. And this is being used and adapted to look at organizational culture change. So I'll just put the link in the chat for everybody.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this webinar and for our amazing panelists. Such a pleasure and privilege to be with you today. We're going to wrap up now, but we have recorded this. We're also going to paste a survey into the chat. We would love it if you could fill this out. We see this as voice as an ongoing conversation, right? We are going to keep bringing these real conversations to the table and get more of these organizations and actors who need to hear what we're talking about to help us transform the system. So thank you so much. Stay safe and well, everyone. The survey is going to be emailed out to you, actually. Sorry for that change, but please stay tuned for that, and we'd love to hear from you. And if you want to join forces with us and continue the conversation, please let us know. Thank you.